I'm Dr. Jillian Horton. I'm a writer, I'm a specialist in internal medicine, and I am the author of the book, We Are All Perfectly Fine. And I am ready to start digging deep.
I'm Mark Sutcliffe, and I'm on a quest to learn from the best. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books and Abacus Data. This is the latest in our series of one-on-one conversations with thoughtful, accomplished people in many different fields. So how did Jillian Horton end up at a 5-day meditation retreat for burned out doctors in upstate New York? And how did that end up changing her life? Jillian Horton is a fascinating person. I hope you get to like her and get to know her as much as I did in this conversation. She is so much more than a doctor. She's a fantastic writer. More about that in a moment. She's also a musician who actually released a pop music record many years ago. She's a teacher, she's a podcaster, and she is a physician who specializes in internal medicine. Jillian's life story is compelling. She became a doctor largely because of her sister, who lived with severe disabilities. And like many physicians, Jillian threw herself into her work and into a soul-destroying system that saps the life and energy from almost everyone who enters it. So on the brink of professional and personal collapse, she went to a form of rehab, a meditation retreat for healthcare professionals. Much to her surprise, and against her initial resistance, the experience transformed Jillian, and it's the basis of her new book, We Are All Perfectly Fine. In it, she very candidly shares some of her most difficult experiences, her guilt, her grief, and some important questions about why we have a system that drives doctors to depression and suicide. I've read the book, and it is both heart-wrenching and hilarious. Jillian is a terrific writer, and her story is a lesson for everyone in overcoming adversity. There is lots in our conversation today about showing attention to the people you love, about using humor in difficult times, about humility, healing, and failure, and so much more. I think you're going to take a lot from this conversation. Now, one last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast and post a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And share this podcast with your network. And if you're looking for more information, please go to letsdigdeep.com. There's lots there for you to see, my blog, my weekly newsletter, and more. Letsdigdeep.com. Now, let's start digging deep with Dr. Jillian Horton. Jillian Horton, it is such a pleasure to meet you and to be talking to you today. I really thoroughly enjoyed your book. I honestly could not put it down. I read it in the space of 2 days. You have a tremendous gift for writing. I don't know how good a doctor you are because I've never been your patient, but you're a terrific writer. And I'm really excited to talk to you about so many themes that arise from your book. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark. It's just an absolute pleasure to be here with you today.
So let's start by getting to know you a little bit. And what would you say is your fondest childhood memory?
My fondest childhood memory is probably when I was around 4 years old, if you can believe it. I have just this little snapshot, flashbulb memory of my mom riding on her tandem bike, or not a tandem bike, but on her regular bike with a little bike seat on the back, and installed me, her passenger, and the wind in my hair, and going down 34th Street in Brandon, Manitoba, just thinking that everything was right with the world.
Wow. That's a nice memory.
Yeah.
That's really nice. Who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
My hero when I was 10 years old was Alan Alda, if you can believe it. I was a MASH fan from the time I was even younger than that. And I had trouble separating Captain Benjamin Hawkeye Pierce from the real person, Alan Alda. I got a little bit better at that as I got older, not totally better, but he was to me just a larger than life figure, and actually someone who I think really influenced the kind of doctor that I am.
Wow. That's really interesting. I know you wrote something about that too in the LA Times.
Yeah.
And just as an aside, I think Alan Alda had difficulty separating himself from Hawkeye Pierce at times,
Yeah.
especially later in the series.
Yes.
Yeah, it kind of went through a bit of an evolution,
Oh
which is kind of
man.
interesting. But yeah, a
Yep.
terrific show. Honestly, one of the
Mm,
best television shows of all time. And
agreed.
yeah, and I can see how it would have affected you as someone who went on to pursue medicine. Wow.
Yeah.
What did you think you were going to be when you grew up? Did you? I know you did have thoughts of going into medicine, but what else?
I definitely thought about medicine, as you say, but when I really look back to what I thought I was going to do when I was very young, I thought I was going to be a writer. And actually, very funny story, or I can save it for later if you want. But when I was 17, I was lucky enough to be invited with another Canadian student to the Nobel Prize ceremonies, to the 90th anniversary of the Nobel Prize ceremonies, based on I was very active in like the youth science fair circuit. So this was just like an incredible, lucky fluke. And when I was there, surrounded by all these kids who were going to do pursue careers in science, one of the Nobel Prize laureates, a fellow by the name of Pierre-Gilles de Jean, asked us all what we were going to be when we grew up. And I blurted out, quite not even planning that I was going to be a writer. That was actually how that event influenced me. So more to
Wow.
that story, but that's
Yeah.
always been in there, competing with the desire to do medicine for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to do both.
I got
There
to
you
do
go.
both. I am very
Yeah.
lucky. Yeah.
Yeah. What would you say is your life story in 6 words?
You know it in your heart.
Oh, I like that. Well, and that comes through in your book. We'll talk more about that. You talk a lot about in the book about forgiving yourself and also acknowledging the things that aren't your fault. And I want to come back to that. But this is an interesting question that I ask every guest, but in your case, it maybe connects with you a little more. What is a mistake that you made that you really learned from?
Without getting into too much detail, I think the overarching principle from that mistake is to protect who you let into your life. So, friendships, relationships, I have learned that certain people exact more energy than they replenish in our lives. And so what I have learned is to keep those people at arm's length.
Wow, good for you. That's a powerful lesson. In fact, I've said this to my stepdaughter a few times, but one of the most effective things you can do to live a better life is to get rid of the toxic relationships.
Absolutely.
Right?
I was just saying to my oldest son the other day, we were walking the dog and talking about this idea. And I was saying that, a friend of mine says how we are the sum of our 3 closest friends. They lift us up to where they are, or they claw us down to where they are. So that same principle is something I think I have learned to actually stick to in my life.
For what do you feel most grateful?
My family and the health of the family members that are alive and with me right now in this moment.
What has been the best year of your life so far, and why?
I think 2 years ago was a profound kind of watershed year for me. And in fact, depending on whether we're going in sometimes I think in an academic year, like a school year instead of a calendar year. But I mean, late 2019, 2020, despite the pandemic, were actually pretty powerful years for me. Probably 2019, actually, if we go according to the calendar.
Okay.
And, for a number of reasons, I think things that I had just been inching towards for years and years and years finally came to fruition. I sold this book, for one thing, which was a profoundly important thing to me in my life, and a number of other things that I had been just tending to for years and years finally began cross-pollinating each other, and everything took off. And finally, the work that I was doing and the things that I was being asked and invited to do aligned with exactly what I had always wanted to do. And those things all just came together in 2019 for a lot of different reasons.
That's so good. Yeah. What was the toughest year of your life so far, and why?
That there are a few come to mind. Certainly, all my years in residency were tough. And so it's hard to choose just one. The internship year, and the one that I talk about in my book, was definitely an extreme low point in my life. And that's partly because we are just pulverized by the amount of work that we're expected to do in that first year in medicine and the subsequent years as well. But that particular year is absolutely excruciating. And then the runner-up, I would actually say in some ways about 4-ish years ago, I was in a different way, not so obviously, also really struggling, working to pull these ostensibly different things together in my life in a way that felt right and organic and authentic, struggling with, I think, boundaries in my job, how much of me other people were entitled to. It's something I talk about in the book too. And so, on a different level, that year was like that as well. But I'm not sure anything can ever quite compete with the soul destroying nature of that first year of residency for many of us.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about why it is so soul destroying and whether, how we can stop that, because there's some really important lessons, I think, coming out of what you write that impact the medical system. What one person has had the greatest impact on your life?
Well, I talk about her in the book, and I think it's my sister, my late sister, Wendy. And as we'll talk about a bit more, she had a profound childhood disability before I was born, actually. So I never knew her any other way. But I think all the best qualities in me as a clinician, and many of the best qualities in me as a human, I can trace back definitely to the experience of being her sister, and what I learned about just unconditional love and what it really means to put someone else first in your life and in your heart.
Yeah, we will come back and talk a lot more about Wendy. What's the most important lesson that you would share with other people?
I would say it's one that also comes out a little bit in the book, and it's the idea that, our efforts matter. Everything that we do as individuals matters and can have all kinds of ripple effects. But the flip side of that is it's not realistic to expect ourselves to be able to be enough to fill critical problems with systems. And not only is that not realistic, but that actually is counterproductive on a number of fronts. And when we stop trying to do that, we're actually better at whatever it is that we're trying to do. And we actually leave something to replenish our inner resources and to be more effective overall. So I guess I would also summarize it as saying it isn't our job to fix every single problem, nor is that possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've been thinking about something similar a lot lately, which is that we all sort of start out with this ambition to change the world in some dramatic fashion and to have enormous impact. And that may actually, and not that it's impossible to do so, but very few people get to. And it may, the pursuit of that may actually distract us from all the tiny ways we can change the world around us or the lives of the people around us or that sort of thing. And then if you're able to focus on all those small things, they actually could add up to something big in a way.
Totally. That completely summarizes how I look at it as well. Yeah.
What do you think people would be most surprised to learn about you?
Probably that I'm kind of an introvert, on one level. I mean, at work, I'm extremely outgoing. I can start a conversation with a piece of toast on a plate, basically, and get it to talk. But when I have the opportunity to, we talked earlier about this idea of protecting our energy. And, I could just as easily, if I'm in the olden days when we could travel, if I'm somewhere for a conference or an event, I actually really just like to be by myself. I like to read. I like that quiet. I find quiet replenishing. And it doesn't always align with, I think, how a lot of people who know me really well might think of what would restore me, or how I would enjoy spending time given the opportunity.
Sure. What's your secret talent? Now, and I'm going to preface this by saying, obviously, you're a doctor and a writer, and then you make this passing reference in the book to how you also you released an album. You were a musician as well. So I don't know. That probably doesn't make it a secret, but you've got that going on as well in your life.
Well, actually, I would say that is my secret talent. It just happens to be a horribly kept secret. So, but it's remote enough. And also, I think I look different enough on the album covers that once in a while, somebody who's, looking up something about me or who I've just met will email and say, "Oh my God, is this you?" It's sort of, I don't exactly know how to answer it. I'm not sure if I mean it as a compliment, but it's, it is like this. I mean, it's almost 20 years ago now, right? It's sort of 17, 18 years ago, but I also did have this very, very, very short career, if a person could even call it that. But I do love songwriting. I mean, I have as big of a drawer full of finished songs as I do of copies of old manuscripts that will never see the light of day. Right. So a lot of people, it's remote enough and separate enough from the current sort of most visible incarnation of my life that a lot of people don't actually know that. So yes, let's call that my secret.
Sure. And what kind of music did you put out?
I would describe it as folk pop, and the strongest influences were, people like Joni Mitchell. I mean, what female Canadian songwriter isn't influenced by Joni Mitchell? But a kind of a storytelling style of songwriting. And, I just love writing lyrics. Like, I feel like if I could have another career that I just could do anything I wanted, one of those careers would be, I would be a lyric doctor for other songwriters. Just come in and, find just the right turn of phrase.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's cool.
I've never been invited to have that kind of doctor, though.
Right.
It's a totally different license.
Instead, you're just a lyrical doctor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have to be happy with that.
Yeah. What's your boldest prediction for the future?
Well, I hope this one is right. My prediction is that the pandemic will force us to rethink who should be politicians and the qualities that we want in our leaders. I'm not sure that it's an incredibly optimistic prediction. It sort of goes against the grain of human behavior through the ages, but it's what I would like to believe may be one of the transformations that we see after the pandemic.
I hope you're right. I'm not sure I'm ready to bet on that, but no. I hope you're right.
No, I'm not either. But but if you do, you'll win a lot of money because the odds are so low.
Exactly. What would be the message of your commencement address? And I think you actually wrote something similar to this recently, right?
Yes. The Medscape conglomerate in the United States asked me to do a virtual commencement last year for all of the American med school graduates whose ceremonies had been disrupted. And in that commencement, what I really talked about was the idea that it's okay to feel what you feel. And I think a lot of what people were experiencing at that moment was grieving for lost rituals, feeling that it wasn't okay to say they were grieving because so many people had lost so much more. And I think that message is really important, that we don't have to try to change what we feel. And it's actually counterproductive to try to change what we feel. What we need to do is try to understand it, and then sometimes just try to learn to work with it differently. So I would even go back to that message a second time if I was giving another address, because I think it really matters, and it's been liberating for me too.
Yeah. What has been a recent epiphany for you? Is there something about which you've recently changed your mind, or some new discovery that you've made?
One of the biggest ones is that everything is not my responsibility. And I mean that in a good way. That can be sort of a nihilistic, negative thing when you say it that way. But I think back to something we were talking about earlier, the idea that I am not the only one carrying a baton or a torch or a message. I'm not the only person trying to change, cultural aspects of medicine. And I think really specifically in terms of why I've been thinking about the specific message, what I started with, that everything isn't about just me, early on in the, you could see early on in the pandemic, I started doing a fair bit of writing about COVID and medicine and COVID. I just really felt a responsibility to do that. But what I quickly realized is that many other people felt that responsibility too. And it isn't just about me being an advocate or speaking up. I mean, there are thousands of other colleagues and people and humans who feel the same way, doing the same thing, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And, just to not to not get caught up in self-importance, like to not think that everything hinges on me writing a piece saying this, and actually it's better when I enlist colleagues to say things with me and do things with me. So just that, we're all part of something as opposed to the only face of something. I think it's also a very productive and actually super liberating message for me.
Yeah. What book are you most likely to recommend to others, other than your new book, of course?
There is a book called You Are Not Your Brain. And it's a book by Jeffrey Schwartz that was, it's a reasonably well-known book, but most people, when I talk to them about that book, they've never heard of it before. And Schwartz is a psychiatrist, I think, down in the United States. And this book had a huge impact on me when I first read it about 5 years ago. Actually, I just randomly happened to pick it up in the bookstore. But I think before this, mindfulness really began to have a transformative impact on me, that book was kind of a gateway for me to really understanding that we have tremendous power to influence the way we think about things. I think before I read that book, I would have said that my brain was a particular way. And, and I talk about this in the book a bit, too, that the thinking patterns that I had, my core beliefs, even though I knew as a physician, the little bit of exposure that I'd had to things like cognitive behavioral therapy, I knew that, yes, we can change and change is possible. I still didn't really believe that that was the case for me. And that book was the book that taught me not only in a really personally meaningful way, the concept of neuroplasticity. But that book actually taught me very simply how to begin to apply it to my own life. And that book was the beginning of a profound metacognitive change for me. It is a totally awesome book. I recommend it to everybody whenever I get the chance.
You Are Not Your Brain.
You Are Not Your Brain. It's counterintuitive.
Okay. Yeah. All right. We're going to take a short break. Jillian, thank you so much for answering all those questions. In just a moment, we will start digging deep with Jillian Horton. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, but in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. check out Zen Books at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. Digging Deep is all about helping you make better decisions, and so is Abacus Data. Most leaders struggle to connect with and engage their audiences. Why is that? It's because they aren't sure how they think and feel and how they will react. Abacus Data can give you the strategic insights you need to make better decisions and to make them confidently. Here's a good example. A major national union was recently negotiating a new agreement for its thousands of members. This had the potential to be a very difficult process. There were many competing interests. So they brought in Abacus Data to conduct thorough and detailed research of their members to learn exactly where they stood, what they were thinking, what they wanted. And as a result, they were able to secure a strong new deal that was accepted overwhelmingly in a national vote. Abacus Data helps all of its clients understand what's really happening in the minds of their employees, clients, and stakeholders. They help them avoid costly blind spots. And they're really good at what they do. In fact, Abacus Data was one of the most accurate pollsters in the 2019 Canadian federal election. Make the one decision that will improve all of your other decisions. Let Abacus Data help you move forward with confidence and clarity. Go to abacusdata.ca. That's abacusdata.ca. Once again, Jillian, it's a real pleasure to be chatting with you, and there's so much that I want to talk about, including your experience as a physician and what you have learned and the very strong message you send about some of the dynamics in the healthcare system that I think really need to be addressed. But I want to talk about the personal journey that you went through that I think is really fascinating. And you share some really powerful stories in the book, some heart-wrenching stories about patients you treated, people who have stuck with you after they have unfortunately passed on. And I know that to an extent you had to fictionalize these stories for confidentiality reasons, but they really resonated with me. And can you tell the story of Mr. Ripple from the book, that story? Because I found that really difficult to read because and certainly it made me relate to your experience as a doctor and the experience of other physicians of what the kinds of decisions they have to make and the consequences they face when they make difficult decisions.
Well, the story that I tell in the book, which, as you say, is a fictional story because of all the complex reasons, being a physician and writing about your experiences, one has to ensure, of course, that no real patient is ever represented without their permission. I had a number of experiences. I have had a number of experiences during my career that informed the emotional tone of that fictional story. And in the story, in the book, I describe the experience of sharing a critical diagnosis with a patient called Mr. Ripple, fictionalized as Mr. Ripple in the book, and sharing the story of a terminal diagnosis, and then having another physician come in and say that they thought that the diagnosis was wrong and that it was actually a treatable, curable condition. And then going back in as a very junior physician and having this patient, Mr. Ripple, absolutely hate my guts and scream at me, just sort of sear me with his absolute hatred of me and being caught in the headlights of that particular emotion that was all directed at me, despite the fact that actually in the fictional case that I describe, I had very little to do with how things actually unfolded. And in fact, the nature of the diagnosis that I had offered in consultation with other folks who were much more senior than me was correct. And he goes on to die very quickly in the end, with his wife being extremely angry at me, and just a terrible toxic change in the dynamic. And I have to say, I think for those of us who are highly relational in medicine, who pride ourselves on compassionate care, who go into medicine because we see the glaring faults in medicine, and even more personally, and we'll probably get into this, for me, the reason I went into medicine was because my family had been scarred by the behavior of physicians, the inhumane kind of conduct, and that motivated me from a very young age to do what I do. And the contrast, the almost indescribable tension between those motivations, the ones I just described, and then being on the receiving end of that kind of hatred, anger, almost a dehumanizing quality of attention. For me, and of course I've experienced that a handful of times in my career in all kinds of different contexts. It's a bewildering, disarming experience that actually I think really cuts to the heart of who you are, which is one of the reasons that it's so painful. I'll tell you another funny story, Mark, about that Mr. Ripple story. My husband, like very few people actually saw this manuscript before it ended up being bought by HarperCollins. And my husband, when he read it, I always remember, like, just like you, that was one of the stories that he settled on, that he said, like, oh my God, when I read that, I just can't even bear to read it. And I don't even like, when other people tell me that, I still feel some surprise. I think, like, oh wow, like you find that a tough story to read, eh? Like, because I think still, even years later, I've almost dissociated from it, like to actually even be able to tell the story or reflect back on it. I cannot inhabit anymore how awful that was. But it's sort of an indirect illumination hearing from other people, even your reaction that's a really memorable story. Like, to me, there are other stories in there that I find far more painful. And I think one of the reasons is that I just had to build a wall around those kinds of experiences, experiences that had, again, a fictional story, but those types of emotional qualities. I just wrote another piece that'll be out next weekend for the Globe and Mail. And there was a story in that piece. Actually, your podcast probably won't be out till after the piece is out. So I talk about when I was a medical student, the experience of walking into a room to see, being asked to go and see a baby with sepsis, and walking in and knocking on the door and expecting, a family and an entourage, and in fact, opening the door and there was no one in there, silence, just this crib, going over thinking the baby had been taken away for a test, and going over and just seeing there's this little baby lying in silence with his eyes open, looking up. There's nobody around him, just the complete feeling of an emotional void in that room, and then picking him up, cuddling him, singing to him, talking to him, and then having to put him back in that crib and leave and walk away. And comparing that to some of what our healthcare providers are going through right now in terms of trying to compensate for all the missing people around, our critically sick COVID patients. But like, even that story, just when my husband was reading that piece, or the editor at the Globe and Mail was just like, I can't imagine a worse story than this. And I'm like, oh, well, then give me an hour. Because
I got loads of them.
That's just an appetizer. But it really has reminded me of, we actually lose our perspective, in medicine, because we begin to judge the worst things by the truly worst things that we see. And it really does, even for those of us who stay very in tune with it and think of ourselves as emotionally intelligent, we forget how traumatic some of these things actually were and continue to be. So we distance a little bit.
Yeah. And I guess you've had time to process that, and people who are reading it are experiencing it for the first time. And I think what I found so heart-wrenching about it was that you did everything right, and you showed a lot of compassion. You helped Mr. Ripple talk to his wife about the diagnosis. and yet it all blew up in your face, even though you didn't do anything wrong, So
Yeah.
and that's something. There just seemed to be, not only was it tragic, but there was something of an injustice about it too, So that kind of cut to the core of me. Yeah.
And a definite helplessness about it, right? That you can't. And I think when I think of some of my most, the experiences that actually have been the most traumatic in medicine, they've all involved some feeling of helplessness, an inability to change what somebody thinks about something, an inability to, really, again, when you're a highly relational person and you really, really, really prize your relationships with patients and families, when something goes sour, whatever the reason, I think it's probably hard for people to understand, nor would I expect them to understand. It isn't their job. They're dealing with their own crises and devastation and loss. But I think unquestionably, most people would be surprised to know how deeply those things affect us and how long the emotional tail of those things goes.
Oh, yeah.
On and on.
Yeah. And so we'll come to what that says about our healthcare system in a moment, but there are a couple of things arising out of that while we're on this subject. You talk about the curse of knowledge, and I wonder if, and by the way, it reminded me, I don't know if you've seen the movie Broadcast News with Holly Hunter, but there's a line in that movie where Holly Hunter plays this television producer, and she, her boss tells her to do something a certain way, and she says he's wrong, and she says, no, I'm not. And he says to her, it must be wonderful to always be the smartest person in the room, to think you know better than everybody else. And she says, no, it's awful.
Yeah.
It's a very good comedic line, but it's also, I don't know, there's something about it that just, I thought was very poignant too. And so I wonder if there's also, as kind of a corollary to the curse of knowledge, which is what you have as a doctor in a lot of cases, there's also this sort of illusion of control that you have this sense, and you're instilled with this belief that you can change outcomes, that you can save lives, you can make a difference. And then because of that, you have more of an expectation that you have dominion over things when you actually don't. Do you think that's the case?
I think there's so much truth in that. And I think it's where certainly a good deal of our internal suffering in medicine comes from. And this is one of my favorite things to talk to, residents and medical students about, is this idea, what you're actually in control of. Like, we're taught, if you ever were to join us on a classic internal medicine rounds, we talk in such hilariously concrete terms. We behave as if there are certainties, and actually there are very few certainties in medicine. There are sometimes simple undercurrents of problems that we can say, unequivocally, this is what's causing A, and then A is leading to B. But we talk, we create problem lists, we speak of plans for dealing with each of these problems, and we cultivate this kind of, false, not a false confidence, but a confidence that is kind of delusional and totally discordant with reality. If I think of like the internal medicine ward where I have attended for the last 16 years, I mean, we, bring people in for skin infections, people who are struggling with underlying substance abuse. And we talk about issue number one is is this person's cellulitis, and what's our plan? We're treating it with this medication. Where are they going to go when they're discharged? We talk about the addiction as if it's a peripheral issue. And in fact, like, we have the model totally backwards. We're trying to impose order on a massive, chaotic problem, and it makes us feel better to do that. It's a way of us sort of finding equilibrium in these complex situations, but it's like just a delusional kind of schema, and it's one that makes us feel good. But I think the further you get into your career, you begin to realize a lot of what I'm doing actually makes no difference. It's a Band-Aid for this moment in time. And this patient is going to be back in the hospital in 72 hours because they have nowhere to live. They have no consistent medical care because their other medical problems render them unable to follow the treatment course that I think they should. Or I'm prescribing something that is evidence-based. Well, guess what? It doesn't apply to that patient because they can't go to the pharmacy and get their medication because they don't even have transportation there, and their social lives are so unstable, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a strong current of trying to distance ourselves from those realities in medicine, and I think a lot of tension is created there as well. So yeah, so all those things that you said, I think are very, very true.
All right, we can come back in a moment to the healthcare system and the really kind of the culture of burnout that's been created for doctors, especially early in their careers. But we should come back to your sister Wendy, and you've actually lost a couple of your siblings, and I sympathize with you. I lost my sister when she was 37 under very different circumstances, but that obviously really resonated with me. Can you talk about your sister and the impact that she had on your life, and how that not only, I think, brought you to medicine, but I think created a desire in you to bring some humanity into medicine as well?
So my sister died 6 years ago at the age of 52, 6 years ago in April. And she was born a perfectly healthy child with totally normal neurologic development until about the age of 4. And then she began having difficulties with her balance, headaches. And my parents started taking her to physicians for assessment of these symptoms. And they were really blown off. A lot of people said they were just anxious. And coincidentally, when my sister was still a toddler, my brother was born. He was a couple of years younger than her. And he had a patent ductus arteriosus, or a congenital heart defect that coincidentally, or incidentally rather, was probably due to him having rubella in utero. So, which is interesting because there are all these ties, now of things I look at in terms of the anti-vaccine movement and people not really understanding the lifelong impact of some of these diseases and things we don't know. But so, my parents, just for the context, by the time, when my sister was 4 and they started taking her for investigation of these symptoms, probably a lot of other physicians just said, well, they're anxious because their other child is so sick, and they had this devastating, near miss with him and his chronic health problems. But basically, when she was about 6, they were actually in London, Ontario, taking my brother to a pediatric heart specialist. And while they were there, they said, we have the feeling that something is wrong with our daughter. And do you think you could get someone to have a look at her? And that cardiologist listened to them, asked a pediatric neurologist to see her. And that neurologist, within a few minutes, had made a diagnosis of what he suspected was a brain tumor, and she had surgery just a few days later. So the listening, the taking people seriously, his compassion for my family. I talk about the negative experiences that my family had, but the positive experiences also left a lasting imprint. And that pediatric neurologist, I think, was one of the first people to really unknowingly influence me in terms of what I had, the philosophy that I have about how we have to treat people and taking people seriously and listening to families. So after my sister's diagnosis, as I mentioned, her surgery was just a few days later. And then she had this postoperative meningitis that left her profoundly disabled. So she was wheelchair dependent. She was severely hearing impaired. She had severe vision impairment and a lot of behavioral challenges, as I talk about in the book. So, it was as if really she'd had an acquired brain injury and her frontal lobe was really damaged. So she struggled to inhibit impulses. So, if she would just tell people exactly what she thought of them, the good and the bad. It made her an incredibly challenging person to live with, to support. to care for, but it also made her, this incredible, unique, hilarious, amazing human being. I mean, I've been a doctor for for over 20 years and in medical school for some years before that. And I have still never met anybody, anything like her. I mean, that's just how unique she was, how funny, how maddening, how, just very, very unrepeatable. And I guess I saw, I bore witness from the time I was a child to how the world treated her. And frankly, for the most part, the world treated her horribly. My family were advocates from the youngest age that I can remember, long before kids were, it was regarded as a basic right for kids to have supports in schools and educational assistance and, attend regular classrooms, not be segregated into classrooms for children with disabilities. Those were all things that my parents fought for, and the cost to them, the humiliation, the nastiness of people, the things people said, the things bureaucrats said. I mean, those things leave scars, I think, that we all bear to this day. And there's one story I share in the book too, of a particular pediatric neurologist who I learned since writing the book has died, and actually died many, many years ago. But that physician in particular, the cruelty with which he treated my parents, and the seared memory of the phrases and the indifference and the kind of the devaluing of my sister, those things, they leave a mark forever. And it's something that I think medicine in general does not understand well enough, that we think, well, I have one interaction with you, I tell you something in maybe not the most compassionate way, but whatever, that my job isn't to be your best friend. Like, that is such a misrepresentation of what our job is and what our role is in people's lives during the worst possible moments.
Yeah, and what the way you describe now and in the book, what results from your exposure to Wendy through your childhood and your decision to go into medicine and that sort of thing. What I think is interesting about it is in a lot of ways, some people might just sort of simplify that story and boil it down to, you grew up with a sister who was disabled, and your parents had a bad experience with the healthcare system. So you became a doctor and decided to change it. And it would be as simple as that. Yeah. But it's so much more complicated than that, right? Mm-hmm. And you carry with you so many different feelings and emotions, survivor's guilt, and all these other things, right? So it's a twisted path and a messy one. And
totally. And you're so right. And another interesting aspect of that for me has been navigating, like, even my own physician identity, at the beginning of my training, being different, thinking of myself as someone who was actually apart from this culture, hating some of the fundamental things about this culture, hating, some of the messaging when I was a medical student and resident, the way that I would see, people training the next generation of physicians. In some cases, I mean, obviously there were examples that were the polar opposite. I mean, I definitely found my people in medicine very early on, and the people who shared my values and cared for people in a way that was aligned with what my core beliefs and values are. But, early on, I talk about it in the book, and it's exactly the way I felt. I felt that I was infiltrating, the enemy ranks. I mean, I really, our experiences had been so even experiences that weren't like really negative were still fraught with incredible stress, a feeling of walking on eggshells, a feeling that, if you made too much trouble, asked too many questions, that people would, label you as a troublemaking, difficult family. And that happens in medicine. It happens all the time. And because I lived it, I know A, what it feels like, and B, what it does to people to be treated like that's you, like that's who you are. So all these other things came about as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess what I would ask about the healthcare system is how is it, because I actually think that people are fundamentally good, and that
Mhm.
therefore, when you see a pattern of behavior from people within a system, uh, it's probably something is wrong with the system, not with the people.
Mhm.
And yes, everybody makes their individual choice, but you don't want a system where someone like you has to swim upstream in order to
Yeah.
bring humanity to your role. And I'll share very quickly one experience I had with the healthcare system, which, and by the way, I lost my sister and my dad, and
Mm.
many people that we were exposed to were wonderful. So I don't want to
Mhm.
paint the entire healthcare system with one experience, but I had appendicitis about 11 or 12 years ago, and my family doctor diagnosed it. I went and got an ultrasound that confirmed it, and I showed up in the emergency room of the hospital, and it was clear that I had appendicitis, but a doctor there had to diagnose it first before they could give me any pain medication.
Mm.
And my appendix burst, and I was in like incredible pain for 3 hours before a doctor would see me, because I wasn't the highest person on the list. And at one point, I remember seeing a doctor in the area where I was waiting, training somebody else on how to use the computer system. And as he walked by me, I said, "Can you help me, please?" And he ignored me and just kept walking by. And
Mm.
I remember in reflecting upon it after, I thought, if I had been anywhere else except in a hospital at that moment,
Yeah.
there would have been people rushing to help me. Now they
Yeah.
wouldn't have been able to help me because they weren't qualified, but if I
Yeah.
was in a restaurant or a shopping mall or just on the side of the road, there would have been people coming to help me. But here I was in this environment where the default was to not help me
Yeah.
until
Exactly.
until the
Yeah.
right moment. So
Yeah.
how did we create a healthcare system like this? What
Yeah.
can we do to change it?
Well, that is such a powerful and reality-based example that you just gave, of and what I found myself thinking about as you tell that story is also the conditioning. So there's someone teaching someone else, maybe a medical student, right, to use the computer. And what learning has just happened in that moment. The medical student has just learned, I can do that too. I can also walk by a patient who's calling out for help and pretend I don't hear, because that's what my role model just did, because that's what we do. And so I also totally agree with what you said earlier, Mark, that I do believe most people, I remember reading a statistic somewhere a while ago that broke it down and said, 20% of people we can probably always count on to do the right thing, regardless of external influences. There are another 20% who maybe their impulses and instincts are really not that good, and we may not be able to count on them at all. And everyone else is somewhere in the middle, and everyone else will be influenced by what they see. So that's kind of the premise that I operate on as a clinician, as an educator, as a team member. I think there are some people I'm never going to be able to reach. I'm not here for them. Someday, there's a whole different question about how do those people get into the healthcare position and roles of trust to begin with. But for everybody else, I believe what you said, I can influence them by showing them another way to be. So, critically important. Actually, you just made me think of another really important example for me too. Even though I am think of myself, of course, as hugely patient centric, as very emotionally responsive to people around me, I still remember a year fairly early on in my practice. And I was working I spent some weeks working during the year in a community hospital where things could be very busy and very stressful. And one day I was at a nursing station, and so sitting kind of at the desk in the middle of like a 20 bed area. And I sort of peripherally, while I was working on my note, I think it was a Saturday, overheard a patient family member looking for some information about something. And it was to do with another patient. It was to do with another patient who had been admitted to another physician. So I just, I was exhausted. I was overworked. I kind of kept my blinders on, kept writing when I needed to be writing. And then a few minutes later, a senior physician colleague of mine at that hospital, who's just a profoundly compassionate, amazing human being, a role model, he was also at that desk, but instead of doing what I was doing, he actually went over, because he heard the person inquiring either of a nurse or that they were asking a question that somebody couldn't answer. And he said, maybe I can help you. And then that patient, said, well, I'm
Wow.
really concerned. Dr. So-and-so has prescribed morphine for my mom. And, she reacts very badly to it. I can't find him. I don't know who to talk to. And I'm just sort of sitting there listening to all this and learning. And, this senior doctor, he says, well, now I can tell you, we do use very small amounts of morphine in elderly patients. I don't know your mom. I can also tell you that Dr. So-and-so is an excellent, kind, and compassionate doctor. And I would let him look after my family member any day. I trust his judgment, but let's see if we can find out when he's going to be coming by. And I remember, again, and here I am, right? A person who thinks of myself in a certain way because of my family experiences. That was a profound learning moment for me, seeing my colleagues step up, noticing how quickly, early on in my career, I had begun, here's something I would have never said 5 years ago, right? That I'd be doing, just kind of looking the other way, trying to finish my own work, ignoring somebody, looking for a family member. And just that, that sentiment, maybe I can help, and it's just a total difference in outlook. It's a complete reframing in the moment of what our job is in the hospital. Our job, we so often get caught up in thinking it's just to do my work. It's to manage my own things. This job is so hard. All I can do is just keep my head above the water versus, it's a kind of servant leadership attitude, isn't it? It's like, I'm here to serve. And when we shift to that framing, people, of course, we delusionally think at the beginning, that's going to be harder. I can't take that on. But we forget that there's this bi-directional healing and enlivening that occurs in that moment, that when we engage with people in that way, maybe it takes us an extra few minutes, but it elevates us. It reminds us why we're doing what we're doing in the first place. So I always think of that moment. And I often tell my learners that story as a reminder of how easy it is for any one of us when we're influenced by what the mass of people around us are doing to become something that we never had any intention of becoming. And we do have to stay vigilant about that too.
And I think that's a great lesson for anybody, really, in any leadership role, in any service role, that you can elevate yourself. It's not a sacrifice to put other people first and to continue to do the things that you always set out to do in your work, rather than get bogged down in the things that take you away from that, but you feel like you have to do in the moment,
There's another story you just made me think about too. And it's one, again, it ties back to when I had worked at that community hospital, which was is a different experience, I think, than working in a teaching hospital, a tertiary care center. And I had moved on to, I was at this point working at the teaching hospital. And, I think at that stage, really feeling, caring for far bigger patient loads than anyone would ever say is safe or wise or allows us to provide the kind of care that we want to provide. And one day, sitting there post-call, exhausted, totally overwhelmed, my pager goes off. It's paging me to locating. And I answer the page and I call central paging. And it's Dr. Horton answering my page. And one of the nice switchboard operators says to me, I have this patient's wife looking to talk to you. And I said, well, I don't know that name. And she said, well, she said you cared for her husband last year and he died. And, I feel my irritation, right? I've been up all night, I've barely slept probably in the last 14 days. And I'm going, just like in that previous story, down a path of, that, again, what I never imagined I could become. So I sort of said, well, I don't know why, she would be calling me a year later, but anyway, put her through. So I'm already in this posture, right? This kind of antagonist, negative, look how important I am with my cynicism and all the other things I have to do. And then this woman comes on the other line and she says, tells me her name. And she says, I don't know if you remember me, Dr. Horton. And again, I'm feeling in my mind, I'm impatient. I'm thinking of all the things I have to do. And she says to me, I just wanted to thank you. And I never got to thank you. And I have thought about you every day for the last year. You came in the last few days of my husband's life. You changed his medications. You gave him medication that made him comfortable. You sat with us. You talked with us. I never saw you after he died. And I always wanted to tell you how grateful I was. And, that
Wow.
moment, it was just like, you just feel that the universe gives you these wake up calls,
Yeah.
to say, get back on track. Because here's this woman, I'm ready to take her head off,
Yeah.
right?
I don't have time for this.
That I don't have time for your gratitude and your
Yeah.
kind words, and it just reminding me, oh my God, like even our humility as clinicians, for those of us who see humility as one of the core aspects of our identity, it is so easy to lose. Like you have to constantly go back and go back and go back and say, I am not important in the way that I think I am, or my priorities are not, the priorities that I might think are my priorities at this moment. Maybe I've lost sight of the bigger picture, but that call was such an incredible gift to me. And it was, again, one of the moments that I go back and I remind myself how easy it is for us to put on, I think of it as like the cloak of cynicism, which makes us feel really important. Oh my God, I'm so busy. I'm so overwhelmed. And, when we do that, we put that cloak on at a cost. We miss all these other beautiful signs of gratitude, the things that actually can also really renew us and keep us fresh in our work. That cloak of cynicism is impermeable to those things. So that's a
great story. And it actually makes me think not just of leadership roles and things like that, but parenting, right? Because the number of times as a parent, my default is, what do you want now? And it's like, and then I say to myself, like, you made this kid, you introduced this. What did you think was going to happen? They're going to want your attention. They're going to want your time. Why are you,
Exactly.
And an easy trap to fall into.
And our full attention, like you say, Mark, and that's one of the, all the work in the last few years that I've been doing in mindfulness and mindful practice has really, again, it's so humbling because it reminds you, it shows you, well, maybe I'm pretty good at giving my patients my full attention. Maybe I'm half decent at giving it to my allied healthcare colleagues. But, I still always have a lot of work to do when it comes to giving the gift of that full attention to the most important people in my life, my kids, my husband, my close friends. The people who should get the best of us often end up getting the scraps of us. And that, again, it's just like with that phone call. It's a thing that we have to constantly be making conscious, or else we're not even aware that it's happening, and it's changed.
So true. A big part of the book is you going to this retreat, and I think maybe you're I think you're playing it up a little bit at the beginning, but you arrive there as a bit of a cynic, I think, a skeptic, and you sort of go through that experience that I've been through myself when I've been in these 5-day courses or team retreats or that sort of thing, where it's like, oh, they're going to put us through these exercises and they're going to try to prove some point here, and they're going to make us do role playing, and and you're just like, I don't want to do this. But you undergo a transformation through that, and it actually, I have to admit, when I discover at the end that not only have you benefited from this retreat, but you're going to go back another time, and that you're going to end up becoming someone who is a kind of a teacher in this environment. That caught me by surprise. So can you talk a little bit about that experience and the transformation you went through?
I think it is in part a reflection of the deep degree of burnout that I experienced in my career, and the kind of burnout that I was in when I first went down to my first trip to Chapin Mill, which is the name, as you say, of where the retreats are held. That was part one, like or sort of aspect one of it was just that I really was very burnt out. I'd lost, some of my connection, not so much with my clinical work, but with my role as a teacher. Because I think if we think back to why I went into this work in the first place, it's obvious why teaching would be so fundamentally important to me, because that's the way we change the experience for other people. I mean, I'm only one person when I look after my patients, but I can multiply my impact by, teaching students to emulate the things that I think are ideal in a clinical encounter. And I had really hit a wall, as I describe in the book, with, some of the aspects of medical culture and student culture and student expectations, and kind of, what that had been like. So I was definitely burnt out on that side of it as well, which was a relatively new but pretty important development. But also, when I was like dating back to the time I was a resident, I think what part of my cynicism was rooted in is that, you feel like you are hemorrhaging to death from a wound, and somebody walks by and they go like, do you want a muffin? Like the offering is so discordant with what your experience is that it actually adds to your sense of moral injury. And I think that actually also speaks to why so many physicians are resistant when anybody comes in and says, we're going to talk about mindfulness or resilience. Like I always remember this moment of the muffin when I was a resident, and one day coming in my third year to the hospital, and there's a big banner that says Resident Appreciation Week, and there's a plate of muffins. And I remember like just this moment of being overcome with rage, picking up this muffin, wanting to use it to beat somebody to death, and thinking like, I don't need a muffin, I need a psychiatrist. Like I need help. But you're offering me a muffin. I mean, it's just, it pushes your button, and I think that was part of my reaction to, how can this garbage help me? But at the same time, also a sense that I needed something. And, I talked in the beginning of our conversation about this book, You Are Not Your Brain. And I had read that book, I think about a year before I first went down to Chapin Mill. And it had really primed me to the idea that, okay, maybe there are other skills I can learn, because that book had allowed me to disentangle myself from, some really dysfunctional thinking patterns, and sort of a tendency to perseverate, a tendency to rethink the same problem over and over, to get caught in the same emotional ruts. So, I was a bit opened by that book to the idea that Chapin Mill could help. But what I never expected, I think maybe I expected to learn some new skills there, but I did not expect to find myself embracing the experience wholeheartedly. I just never thought of that as part of, how part of who I was. I'm a very emotive person, as you can probably tell, but I don't think of myself as a mushy person. I have kind of a set point that I think is actually common to a lot of physicians. We kind of, we talked at the beginning about distancing from really difficult things, and
you use humor a lot, right, to deflect
totally
from things. And
God, yeah. And we use humor that often does not translate into the real world. So, when I think of some of the most hilarious moments of my training, if I tried to explain those to you now, you would say, you are a crazy woman. Like you and your friends should all have a forensic psychiatry assessment. But yeah, it comes back to Viktor Frankl, right? It's abnormal circumstances, abnormal behavior in those circumstances is normal behavior. And again, to be really clear, the things that we found funny, or the humor that we found, they were never at the expense of people, or never, never mocking or anything. They were just finding humor in the most miserable situations and moments. Kind of like, if you really watch an episode of MASH and begin to deconstruct what they're finding humor in, what they're laughing at, weaponizing humor in a positive way. I think that sort of ties in. So yeah, I just did not expect for that first retreat and subsequent retreats to affect me so powerfully. But what I also learned, I guess, in the process was, we talk a lot about, and I certainly talk in the book about the idea of metacognition, learning to understand our thoughts, watching our thoughts unfold, describing them and understanding our thinking patterns. And one of the things that I learned is that I often default to cynicism, or when things begin to get uncomfortable, I, make a joke and draw a line and don't go any further. And I was, I described this moment in the book, and it was a really powerful moment for me, that hearing Nick Krasner one morning in the Zendo read this particular poem by David White of Enough, and the line from the poem that really, it's another kind of flashbulb moment in my life, was just, the idea of a life we have refused again and again until now, and really raising that question with me. Why wouldn't it be okay for me to feel better? Why isn't it okay for me to to dig deep into this work and to go to these places if it'll help me feel better. And I really did realize that that was a stumbling block for me, the idea that it was okay to not be, carry the darkness of the things that I have experienced in my own family life and the things that I experience day to day in the hospital, that it's actually okay to find a way to just not constantly be carrying that. So that was really profound for me.
Yeah. It's okay to have a good life, as someone said to you at one point, right?
Yes.
And you wrote about, and we talked about this briefly earlier, but acknowledging the things that aren't your fault and forgiving yourself for the things that might be your fault. And I think we all struggle with that, and maybe for doctors the stakes are so high that all these things that you describe are just so much more apparent. But in a way, I think that's applicable to everyone, isn't it?
I think so. And I think there is this, there's kind of the last hand on, the one who wrote the order or the one who gave the medication. No matter all the things that came before, there is this feeling that you can have when things go poorly, when a treatment is not effective, or worse still, when a mistake is made. But, that this is personal, that this is you, that you.
Well, you mentioned your name being on somebody's hospital bracelet, right? And that's, I never thought of it like that before, but how could that not feel personal?
Absolutely. Even when I had a spate of time a few years ago, just a particularly brutal couple of weeks on my clinical teaching unit service, and just death after death, every day. I think most people know, but when you're an inpatient physician and one of your patients dies, of course, you have to go and fill out a death certificate, and thinking like my name on paper after paper, sheet after sheet, like this strange connection, as if this is, it can be hard not to personalize that, or to connect yourself to it in a way that is not actually reality based.
Tell me what mindfulness means to you and how you practice it. And I gather you're starting to tell other doctors about it too. And I'm guessing this is a total stab in the dark on my part, but it's probably not. It's not something that's been a big part of the medical community's way of thinking about things, right?
Absolutely, that was a good, well-informed yes. So I think of the definition that Jon Kabat-Zinn, and a lot of people have read his work, Full Catastrophe Living is one of his best known books, but he talks about mindfulness as a moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness of the present unfolding of our experience. And for me, I guess the word that kind of blew my understanding open of what mindfulness really is, the word is non-judgmental, and that's what I had never understood before. I thought that mindfulness had an agenda, and I always kind of resented that agenda. I thought it was to make me happier, to sort of sanitize my thoughts, to, kind of be this Pollyanna person seeing a brighter side of things. And actually, that was a complete misconstruction of what mindfulness really is. Instead, it's getting more in tune, right, with what we're actually thinking and what we're feeling and experiencing it, but not constantly qualifying it or assigning it a value. And I think actually that's what was so threatening to me about the concept. And I talk about why, in the book, that I was really attached to my suffering. And some of that it definitely comes from, the tremendous disparity between what my life is like and what my two siblings' lives were like. I mean, their lives were brutally difficult. And even the rest of my family, my fortunes have felt at different times, significantly different than ours. It was than mine, rather. And everything outwardly has always appeared to come so easily to me, like what my family used to joke that I just had a Midas touch, and so it was.
You probably felt you had no right to have things so easy, right?
Oh,
watching your siblings struggle so much.
Absolutely.
For example.
It was hard to you have no choice to accept it, but to accept it because it's the way it is. But there's also this part of you that goes like, this just doesn't feel right. It feels so grossly, unfair. And the disparity was so profound. Often the situation is one child has a profound health issue or a disability and the other children don't. But, in my situation, I mean, I just, again, was always that person who seemed to have everything good showered on me and in my life. And I have had incredible good fortune for which I'm so grateful, but not a but, period. And at the same time, it's really hard to carry the weight of all those good things when what you really wish could be the case is you would just much rather see them distributed evenly among the people that you love. And I struggled a lot with that earlier in my life. So I think that history is one of the things that made it so hard for me. When I come back to that moment again that my colleague described, that the life we have refused again and again until now, I think that's part of why I refused that idea that there was something that could help me work differently with painful thoughts, with painful experiences, and with suffering. So when I think of how mindfulness, manifests in my life now, and what a clinical practice of it is like, one thing I sometimes think is like, we chose not the best word. Like, I think from a branding point of view, we would have an easier time selling mindfulness to physicians and maybe also to business executives if we called it, metacognitive self-regulation skills or training, like something like that, instead of, mindfulness as a word does tend to have connotations that make people think of, granola and yoga and touchy-feely. Totally. Yeah. And things that it really is not associated with in my experience, but I get that. So what the practice looks like for me now, I guess it primarily takes two forms. And one is just a quality that is present, during lots of moments of my day, not every moment, not all the time. I'm not, my mind has the same defects that everybody else does, or the same default or maybe factory settings, I guess is a better way of putting it than defects. But, my mind wanders just like everybody's. My thoughts can become, overly clouded by particular emotions. But I guess, with a regular practice of, again, what I think of as a metacognitive practice, tuning into my thoughts, noticing my emotions, noticing what's physically present, and becoming aware of those things at a very early stage, instead of, sometimes when I'm teaching, I talk about it as the difference between, if you're looking after a small child and the child wanders away, it's much better if you notice that the child has wandered away when they're in the backyard, as opposed to when they've wandered to the park or then crossed the river or gotten on an airplane at the airport. And it's, noticing things before they get further and further away from you, thoughts, emotions, etc. And then there's also a cognitive energy piece to that too, I think. When you notice that your thoughts have wandered earlier rather than later, I think of it that there's less energy required in bringing your mind back to what you're trying to focus on. And that process is constant, of the wandering, bringing back, wandering, bringing back. But for me, the training has allowed me to, notice when my mind is going to other places, to notice why, to notice physically what's happening in my body, which is often really important information, that an interpersonal conflict is escalating, or sometimes, that this work has also really affected me as a clinician. And I can think of a few cases in particular where I've noticed a feeling that normally I might have tried to ignore because it was unpleasant. And sometimes it's, tapping into that feeling and saying, that feeling is there to tell me something, and really tuning in, instead of just saying, well, I should just focus on my thoughts and my diagnoses and not what I'm feeling, listening and saying, I'm on the wrong path. That's what that feeling is about. Or this patient is about to get critically ill. That's what that, and there's very little outward sign. And so, all that information is there for us, but we just get such mixed messages, as you say, in medicine about, is it okay to tune into that? We're taught to ignore our feelings. We're taught to ignore our physiologic needs. So it's really no shock then, at the end of a training process or deep into a career, that suddenly we stop and say, I don't actually even know what I'm feeling. I don't even have a word for it. I don't actually even know what stress in my body feels like, because I've had to just take that circuit out at the fuse box in order to survive, because that was the only way that I knew how to do this. So a lot of this work, it's counterculture, because it's saying to physicians, the way that we have been taught to cope, or for many of us, the ways that have been modeled for you to cope are actually, they have deprived you of critical information, and they've also deprived you of ways to, deal with, our intimate face-to-face encounters with suffering, with our own suffering, with our own mortality. So that's what can make the pill, I think, so hard to swallow. It's just like that idea. Also, that story I told about the Resident Appreciation Week and the plate of muffins. People think, my wounds are so gaping, and you're offering me this garbage. And that is part of the process, actually, of letting people express, how much pain is there to begin with, and acknowledging, there's no single cure for this. Mindfulness is not a one shot,
Right.
panacea. And I also would point out, I think, Mark, that what really healed me and what really had a profound impact on me. I mean, yes, a big part of it was mindfulness, but part of it was also the community, and part of it was also relational, and, forming these new, deep, profound relationships and attachments with friends and colleagues with whom I now have, all kinds of regular conversations about just how we're doing and what work we're doing to change the culture. So I should not underestimate the role of that kind of new community in how I sort of found my way to a different place.
But I think what you're speaking about is the culture around your profession, and again, it's the environment that's created where the rewards are there and there's where the rewards and punishments kind of incentivize and disincentivize certain behaviors, and you start to think that what's expected of you is to never be sick, to be working like crazy, to be working on no sleep, and to place value on that, as opposed to going about things in a slow, mindful, thoughtful, compassionate way, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you're right. There's a lot of disparaging of that stuff too, and it's one of the things that the work, ironically, has also prepared me for, is for the backlash, because sometimes when you go to give a grand rounds or lead a workshop, right at the beginning, you're encountering not just cynicism, but hostility about, that people feel that this work is an affront to the way that we're supposed to work. And part of learning to sit with your own difficult emotions, by extension, you often learn to sit with other people's difficult emotions too. And I constantly am getting better and better at that as a teacher, and also, just encouraging people to say those things and put them out there, because once they've expressed what their aggravations and misgivings are, it becomes a little bit easier for me to acknowledge the validity in them. And then, we can start to find, okay, where we might still have alignment despite those views.
So the last thing I want to ask you about is your writing process, because you managed to write this book at the same time as going through this transformation, teaching others, being a doctor, continuing to have a practice. So how were you able to do that? And what was your writing process like to produce this fantastic book?
Well, the story of this book really begins with the story of another book. So my middle child is 10 years old. And when he was just a few months old, in the years leading up to his birth, as I shared with you at the beginning, writing has been a huge part of my identity and my psyche for my entire adult life, and was always on the agenda as something that I knew that I needed to do. And in fact, I used to always have a to-do list with all my major projects on it. And for literally, 20 years on that to-do list was write a book, right underneath, take out the laundry and do your taxes. It was kind of ridiculous, actually. But it was a constant source of pain from me to know that I wasn't moving forward with writing in this way, because it was so important to me. So around the time that my middle boy was just a few months old, I actually had a little bit of a breakthrough. I read Gretchen Rubin's book, The Happiness Project. And, one of the things that she takes on in that book is in a month, she always wanted to write fiction. So she takes on this commitment to write a book in a month's time, and points out that you only have to write 1,000 words a day to end up with, at the end of 30 days, a 30,000 page novella. So I thought, the book overall just made a lot of things feel tangible and actionable to me, even with, a toddler and an infant at home. And I thought, I can do this for a month. I have to do this. And so I started that month really recommitting to cultivating the habit of writing. And at the end of that month, and I would do this, I would take my kids out I was on maternity leave, and I'd take them out in the car for a drive. And when they were both asleep, I would park somewhere and roll the windows down, and I would write on my laptop. And, it was
sitting in the car,
wow. Wherever the opportunity arose, or after they fell asleep at night, I would start, just getting writing. You can probably hear them in the background now. And they're, it was sort of just accepting that this is the circumstance. This is, if I want to do this, I cannot wait for an imaginary perfect time, because that perfect time, not only may it never come, but what does it mean anyway? What the perfect time, if you haven't done the work and then the interval appears, you won't have a writing habit to fall back on. So after writing that for that first month, actually, I kept writing hardcore for a couple more months, and I produced, I had a work of fiction about medicine that was obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but that was very heavily based on my own experiences, a book about a mother in medicine who also wanted to be a writer. It was a little transparent, but I had the good fortune of getting that book in front of the late, great editor at McClelland and Stewart, Ellen Seligman. And we spoke about the book. They were very interested in the book. Apparently it was widely read at McClelland and Stewart. And we had a phone call about it. And in that phone call, Ellen said to me, she gave me a number of pieces of feedback about things that weren't working in the book. And then she said, if you can address all these things, we'd be very interested in seeing another draft. And she also said something to me that really resonated. And she said, I just wonder if this book is actually fiction. And that was like it was a light bulb that I didn't want to see flickering, because I knew actually that was the truth. And I knew that I had written this book as fiction because I just didn't want to be held accountable for all the messy stories in the book, all the difficult stories, the painful stories, but I wasn't yet able to internalize that message. I just filed it away as something important somebody had said. So I went away and I worked on these edits for about a year, and I sent the manuscript back to her. And she read it. She was very kind. And they got back to me and said, you know what, it didn't quite work. Boom, that was the end of it. And that was like 4 years into this process. So this was like really painful, and anyone who's ever almost sold a book knows that in some ways it sounds even lamer than actually never having written a book, because you start feeling like all your friends just think you're making it up. And it was really excruciating, because I put 4 years of work into that book, and I think I couldn't even really admit to other people how disappointing that was. Because again, remember in my day-to-day life, I'm a doctor. People are dying. They're dealing with, catastrophes. So how sad am I allowed to be about not selling my book? How big of a problem is this? And it again gets back to some of the things I write about in the book, in terms of where giving your own problems, your own feelings, your own experiences any actual rank. But so this book kind of sat around for a long time, and I had a writing mentor from my years as an undergrad at Western, who has continued to be a major figure in my life, a Canadian writer by the name of Stan Dragland. And I would correspond with him periodically. He's the person who got it in front of Ellen Seligman to begin with. And he said, he read it for me, gave me some feedback, said, this is salvageable. Like, there's some really good stuff here. But I also think I knew in my heart And that's one of the reasons why that has continued to be one of my most important messages, that what Ellen Seligman had said to me was actually true, that I was writing fiction as a
proxy
way out, as a proxy.
Yeah.
And I was doing it in lieu of doing the really hard work that I needed to do of telling an authentic story. So I continued to fumble around, write little things. And then on my way back from either my first or second trip to Cheap and Mill, I think it was my second trip, I was writing in a book. I had started to scribble down different things about, profound moments from the experience there. And I wrote in one of my books on the airplane on the way back, I wrote, what if this is the story? And suddenly that light bulb totally went on, because I really did understand on that journey, there is something about a journey, right? Actually, it's one of the things I miss about no travel is I do some of my favorite writing in airports with earplugs in. And that moment, I was just like, this is the story, because everything that had happened to me in those trips, it tied back to the most important moments of my life, tied back to my identity, tied back to, this core question of suffering. And once I understood the structure of the book, and how I could tell the story, the book wrote itself in a certain way. I mean, I developed the practice in the years earlier, and that's why that first precursor book, Full of Failures, actually made me just a very strong writer by the time that I was writing this book. And so it really only took me about a year to write the manuscript beginning to end. I went on a sabbatical at the end. I had 6 months to sort of finish writing, but actually at the end of 6 weeks into the sabbatical, I was done. I sent it to this mentor of mine just to see what he thought of it, fully expecting that he'd give me edits. It would take me a year to write. And he said, it's wonderful. So I sent it out into the world, and just shortly after that had an agent and sold the book maybe 6 weeks after signing with the agent. So, on one hand, if I only tell that part of the story, people go, wow, what an amazing thing. And that's how lucky. And I am lucky, I am really lucky. I have a lot of people around me who have made so many of these things possible, including, mentors and teachers and people who always said to me, keep going, you have to do this. But the flip side is there were years beforehand where I failed so consistently that I learned from every one of those failures. And finally, you get to a point where you don't need them to teach you anymore. So the long story, the long path to getting here, on one hand, if a person's looking for a quick fix to writing a book, is very depressing. But on the other hand, if you say by just cultivating the habit, step one, and step two, knowing that the first several years are more likely than not to be fraught with disappointments, failures, rejections, that is the path, that's the normal ascension, then actually I think that story becomes very motivating, because it tells anyone who is really intent on doing this that failure is part of the recipe. So just don't be afraid to add it to the bowl.
Yeah. Those are really powerful words and great advice, and the outcome of that process is a wonderful book that I thoroughly enjoyed. As I have enjoyed this conversation, there's so much that we didn't touch on, but I learned so much from hearing your perspective on all of this. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mark. You got me to think about a number of things in sort of different ways and pulled out some stories I haven't thought of in a really long time. So anytime you want to have a part two, you know where to find me.
Okay, great. Isn't Jillian a terrific storyteller? And don't you just find yourself drawn to her and her story? This really is one of my favorite conversations that I've had on this podcast. Jillian raises so many great questions about our healthcare system and shares so many powerful lessons. I really got a lot from this, and I'm really grateful to have connected with her and learned so much from her. So once again, thank you to Jillian Horton for joining us on Digging Deep. Again, her book is We Are All Perfectly Fine. If you enjoyed this episode, please review it and share it with others. That's going to help us produce more great episodes. And if you want to keep digging deep into topics and lessons like this, or see the show notes, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, or read my blog, you can do all of that at letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. Thank you for listening.